I just want to welcome everybody. This is our March luncheon. So for those of you who have not had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name's Donna Dyson, and I'm National Marketing Director with the Juice Plus Company, but I also have the pleasure of serving as the chair of the Health and Wellness Committee that works together with the Chamber, and we get this luncheon put on. It's great to see you guys after a year.
We're so happy to be back in person. I want to thank Tomball Assembly of God for the use of their building today, Pastor Greg Jenkins, and also Pastors Johnny and Miguel. Well, listen, I don't want all of you who are involved with the Chamber each and every day to answer this question and jump up and down, but do you all, as our special guests, know what a Chamber of Commerce does? Well, let me just put it to you this way. We connect business and community, and really community to business as well. We are all about prosperity and jobs. We want this greater Tomball area to be a place of choice to live, work, worship, and play. And we also like to say that we do what most people think just happens. We have got great partners like the city, the Harris County, our elected officials. We, again, want this area to prosper, you to have jobs and love where you live. And so that's really a lot of what we do. We do so much that it's hard to tell you in 2 minutes. But if you are interested in the Chamber, and I didn't come up here to sell you on that, but we are all about relationship. We love to make connections with you. We need to know you. You need to know us, in other words. And it's about education, leadership, and it's a whole lot of fun. It's serious, but it's a lot of fun to know others around you, other business people.
So I do want to let you know that this is a committee effort, right? I get to be sometimes the face of this, but there are a lot of people behind the scenes that make this happen. And I want to tell you a little bit about our committee. And we do meet on a monthly basis, and really it's just a collaborative effort of different healthcare providers and entities and businesses in this North Houston region that come together and work with businesses and the healthcare community to bring events like this to you and to further education and really support our community and make it a vibrant and healthy place to live and work. We have these luncheons that we have planned for the rest of this year. We have Tomball Night that will be in August, and then we have community blood drives. I do want to make sure that we recognize our lunch sponsor today. So the lunch was given to us from the original Rib Tickler, but that is really made possible because of our lunch sponsor, Tomball Regional Health Foundation. And I want to recognize Lynn LaBeouf as the CEO, Marilyn Kenyo, our Chief Administrative Officer. The Tomball Regional Health Foundation, you guys raise your hands there. I asked them to come up here and they wouldn't come up here today. So now I have to say something, right? So the Tomball Regional Health Foundation administers the proceeds from the sale of the Tomball Regional Medical Center for charitable purposes in our area, and they are a vital part of our community, supporting health and wellness initiatives on behalf of its residents and seeking to meet the broader aspects of health needs in the community. And we are so grateful for everything that you guys have done and for making this possible. We truly appreciate that.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. It's great to see people in person, and if you're on Zoom, it's also great to see you too. So my name is David. I have the privilege of introducing today's speaker. I've known Dr. Mohr for a number of years. Very nice gentleman, very talented. I'm going to read a couple things about his history. He's a pharmacist by trade. He received his bachelor's degree from Texas A&M in 1994, currently resides in College Station, and he received his doctorate of pharmacy from the University of Houston in 1998. So go Cougs. I'm sure you saw they're in the Final Four tomorrow. That's exciting. Next week, or this week. He was an assistant professor of medicine at of an infectious disease at the University of Texas Health Science Center in the medical center. And then he worked for Memorial Hermann for 10 years in the medical center. After that, he transitioned into the pharmaceutical industry, where he currently is a senior vice president of clinical development and medical affairs at scPharmaceuticals, where he's responsible for research programs on the heart and infectious disease. So John is happily married, has 2 beautiful daughters, and today he's going to talk to us a little bit about infectious disease. John?
at the end, when he finishes speaking, we'll actually collect those questions, and he's going to go through and answer them the best that he can. All right? So again, oh, and turn your cell phones off. Miss Brandy just reminded me of that. So if you guys can take a minute, make sure that your cell phones are off. All right, I think that's it, and we're ready. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Donna, and thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this afternoon. If you were coming expecting to hear someone tell you whether you should or should not get vaccinated, you've come to the wrong place. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you what you should or should not do, but hopefully I'll be able to provide you with some information from a perspective from a pharmacist who worked everywhere from Walgreens through a large trauma center at Memorial Hermann, with a little bit of knowledge of infectious disease. In fact, my research and my clinical practice in infectious disease is what I did for 10 years before joining the pharmaceutical industry, where now I'm responsible for conducting clinical trials to show that a product that we're trying to develop and present to the FDA is indeed safe and it's effective for treating the disease in which we're trying to intend for it to be utilized in. And hopefully I'll be able to share some experiences for you, some things for you to think about when you're making this decision for yourself. So I put a few things down just to kind of get us oriented on some of a premise that I think that we should all have in mind when thinking about our health. First and foremost is that we all have a God-given right to choose the way that we want for the health of our bodies and what we choose to put into it, from foods to medicines. And anytime we get diagnosed with any disease, whether it be mild or severe, from cancer to diabetes, we owe it to the clinicians and the physicians that are taking care of us to tell us what our options are. Here's what's happened to me. Tell me what my choices are, so that way I can assess those different choices to determine what's right for me, and what's right for my family. We certainly have the obligation and the right to go out and evaluate and learn for ourselves and try to get that perspective of what we're going to do and how we're going to manage our lives and our health. The second point is infectious disease and public health and free liberty requires a delicate balance, especially when that choice that we're making is around the prevention of a disease that's potentially contagious to other people around us, and the right that I have and the freedom that I have to make a decision and a choice. Infectious diseases is one of the few therapeutic areas in which the disease in which we're trying to manage for ourselves is also contagious by those around us. And how do we take that free liberty into account when it comes into account for being able to potentially have an impact on other people's health around us? A good example is secondhand smoke, right? We have a right to breathe clean air around us. Other individuals have a right to smoke if they so choose to. But where does that right intersect between my right to breathe free air and your right to smoke a cigarette? Infectious disease and public health is the exact same conundrum that we find ourselves in. The third is science is messy. Science is a messy, messy thing. And I've dealt with enough research questions in my career to where I can go look to try to find an answer. And I find the two different papers that are answering the exact same question, but have completely different conclusions, not necessarily because one is right or one is wrong, but one may choose one method and another paper uses a different method. And it results in disparities between what we think is right and what we think is wrong. And it makes for a very, very messy situation, because a majority in medicine, I'm here to tell you, there's no one right answer. If you like math, you like getting the answer to the math problem, science becomes a very, very frustrating thing, because sometimes there's not a specific answer. And that's where the practice of medicine becomes so important and so unique. The fourth point is life is nothing but a game of events that go on that require a risk-benefit decision and probabilities. The example that I've used for medical students and pharmacy students over the years is blackjack. Who plays blackjack? I love to be able to go to Vegas and play blackjack, because there's nothing more satisfying when no matter what hand you're dealt, the dealer is showing a 6, and you're saying, that guy or gal's got 16, no matter what I do, I'm going to win this hand. And then you begin to strategize about, do I double down, do I take a hit? But the worst thing that I could do is bust, because I know that they're going to go over 21. Sometimes the dealer draws the 5 and the 10, and they get 21, and you lose. You did the right thing by managing your hand. You were just unlucky. And I've been on many a side where the dealer just beats the table, but I've been on more sides where the table has beat the dealer. So it's nothing about probabilities, and there's nothing in medicine that is 100% success and 0% risk, or vice versa. So let's talk a little about COVID and SARS, and let's get a little bit of terminology straight. Maybe this is obvious, but I think it's important to say that when we're talking about COVID-19, we're talking about the disease. And the 19 comes from the year in which it was first observed, in 2019. And so COVID is the disease, but SARS, coronavirus 2, is the virus that causes COVID disease that was identified in 2019. So I'm going to go all over the board, and I think the media goes all over the board here, but in general, I would say that these things are interchangeable for the purpose of our discussion today. The second point about this virus that has become personal, and I've been able to observe myself, and many of you probably have been as well, is that this virus discriminates. I have a good friend of mine who her parents went to a funeral in Florida for a family member who died from COVID. And at that funeral, my friend's father contracted COVID. And I had to listen and hear the stories of how he withered away and died in the hospital alone, without his family being able to come visit them. And that actually resulted in us making a decision around Thanksgiving about, maybe we just want to kind of hang back and see how this plays out. Maybe we don't want to get people, put people at risk. We also had COVID run through my family. I had it in December. I contracted it from my mother, who one of her friends went to church, acquired it at church. And so I had it. My wife got it. My daughter got it, and it ran through our house. I was fortunate that it was more like a mild cold to me, but my wife was sicker than I was. But I was really worried about my mother, who's 74 years old and has asthma, and what was going to be the impact on her, and what was going to be her outcome. And then my father lives in North Carolina. He got a call from their pastor at church saying one of our church members came down with COVID. You all might want to go get tested. And so he did, and was positive, and he didn't have a single symptom. So it's amazing to see how this virus can affect so many different people so differently, especially a father of mine who's 75 years old with underlying diabetes who didn't even get a sniffle. And so it becomes difficult to know what to do and what the risk is for myself individually, because the minute I find out how it affects me, it may be too late, or I might be okay. And that becomes the scary part of this of infectious disease in this virus. The third thing is that we really don't understand and know the long-term consequences of what this virus is going to do to us. An example is the human papillomavirus vaccine that came out. Human papillomavirus doesn't kill people, and we knew that human papillomavirus doesn't kill people. But research began to show us that it's associated with cervical cancer. So it's a virus that doesn't really cause bad disease, but we find out later on that it can prevent cervical cancer potentially in young women. So now becomes a reason to get the vaccine, not because it's going to cause me to die, but because it can prevent something that can progress in my health in the future. So unfortunately, we're in a position now with this virus that we don't know what those long-term consequences are. So some things to think about as we talk and start talking about vaccines and the way vaccines work. first of all, and I think everybody knows that vaccines work by preventing diseases. They work by preventing some deadly diseases, and there's other diseases that aren't so deadly, but they can cause some significant health problems. They act by us injecting something into the body that mimics a real life infection. But the body recognizes it and says, you know what, this is something that shouldn't be here. Let me do something to get rid of that. So they respond to these invaders by making antibodies. All vaccines work the exact same way. And if you'll follow with me for one moment, there's always a protein that's put into the body that the body's immune system recognizes that protein. We can put that protein in the body by different ways. Either we can take a dead virus and that has those proteins on the surfaces, and we can inject that dead virus into the body. It recognizes that and makes antibodies. We could also take the little piece of that virus, that is the protein that we want the body to respond to. That's not the whole virus, but a little piece of it. We're going to inject that, and the body's going to recognize that and make antibodies. We could also, and where this becomes interesting for COVID, is that we could inject messenger RNA. Messenger RNA is nothing more than the body's own way of making proteins. It's what determines whether our eyes are green, blue, brown. There's different proteins within our body that determines those things. And we could inject that. The body then makes that protein based upon that messenger RNA that we've identified as a key piece of a virus that we want to focus on. And the other way to do it is to take, rather than injecting the messenger RNA directly, we can take a virus that's not very harmful, and we could put that messenger RNA in that virus. We can inject the virus into the body, and it works the same way. The virus injects the messenger RNA into the cell, and the body ultimately produces a protein, and that protein is sensed by the immune system. So all these different vaccines, and you're going to hear about messenger RNA vaccine versus a traditional vaccine, they all work the same way, and that's by getting the body to produce a protein that's recognized by the immune system to produce antibodies by T cells. But then the body goes one step further, and it's smart enough to say, I want to make sure that I remember what that protein was. That way, if I ever see it again, I know what to do, and I'm going to make those exact same antibodies in order to neutralize and to get rid of that invader, whether it be a virus, a bacteria, or some other infectious cause. And then once the body senses that again, it can produce those antibodies. So that's how the immune system keeps on going and keeps on remembering what things we were exposed to say, last time it made me sick, and now I have a mechanism to protect myself from getting sick in the future. So I had a little video from the World Health Organization that takes this concept and explains it in 30 seconds, but because of internet, we don't have it, but I'll make sure I get it to you and you can take a look at that. But that's my simplest way of kind of explaining how vaccines work. So I'm going to share with you a bunch of information, and I don't want you to focus all on it, but I'm going to use this as a point to make a few, to have some discussions around. And the purpose of this slide really isn't to compare all the different vaccines one against another, especially in terms of their effectiveness, because all these vaccines were all studied in their independently. They were not studied one against another to try to figure out which is the best vaccine to give. So the first point to make is if you look at the trial size above, we're talking about north of 100,000 patients were involved in clinical trials for these three vaccines. In clinical research, this is very, very big. This is huge in terms of a number of individuals participating in a clinical trial. David and I worked for a company back years ago that developed an antibiotic to treat MRSA. Everybody's heard of MRSA and MRSA. We developed this drug and showed that it was effective in treating heart valve disease caused by MRSA. And the FDA gave us an approval for that indication with 124 people. So, and this was a new chemical entity that was developed for treatment of Staph aureus and MRSA bloodstream infections and endocarditis or heart valve. So hopefully that gives you some perspective of these numbers here that we're talking about. These are huge, huge numbers of patients that participate in these studies. The second thing to point out is, and I want to point out this line right here and talk a little bit about the efficacy rate for infection. 95%, 95%, and then 66%. And I believe it was the mayor of Detroit, I think it was a politician in Michigan that came out recently, early March, and said, I'm not letting any Johnson & Johnson vaccine into my state or my community because it's only 66% effective in preventing infection. I'm only going to allow my community to be vaccinated with the Pfizer and the Moderna because isn't 95% much, much better than 66%? And the problem and he's thus retracted his comment, but the problem that he went into is I think where any one of us would go into and say, why wouldn't we think that these other vaccines are better than that one? But because they weren't studied at the same time, they weren't studied in the same study head to head, we can't really compare whether one vaccine is different. What I can tell you is that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was studied between October and February of 2021, mainly in South America. What was going on in South America in October and November that was different than August and September in the US where the Moderna vaccine was? Very, very different times, different places, and you just can't compare one against the other. Well, it's also been said that maybe looking at infection rate isn't the thing that we need to look at because infection could be very, very mild. And if a patient gets mild disease, might that be okay? So many people are saying what we really have to do is to look at efficacy rate for hospitalization or severe disease because we're never going to eradicate viruses and respiratory viruses from the world. They're always going to be there. But if we can figure out a way to make the disease more mild to where it doesn't kill you or doesn't hospitalize you, that could be a potential health benefit. There's a vaccine, has anybody had the pneumonia vaccine? The pneumococcal vaccine. So that's an example of a vaccine that was specifically targeted to immunize you against the most deadly strains of pneumococcus, of strep pneumoniae. It didn't eradicate pneumonia, but if you do get infected by a pneumococcus or strep pneumoniae, it's going to be more of the strains that are more associated with the mild disease. So we're using concepts to develop these new vaccines, the exact same concepts we've used for other things. Adverse events. The adverse events are here. I put the more common ones. The difficult one is, well, what about those rare adverse events? And you probably hear things like blood clots and seizures and things along those lines. It's when you start getting a bit into rare adverse events, one of the things that we have to do is to go back and say, although we saw pulmonary embolism and blood clots in the legs in this study, did we see it at a rate that's higher than what we see in everyday normal life? And when you look at it that way, you begin to say, yeah, we saw some things here, but the rates still are lower or the same as what we would expect in everyday life. Therefore, we don't really think that this vaccine is associated with some of those events. In fact, there's cases of vaccines, the rotavirus vaccine. In that study, children that took the vaccine had less fractures. Well, why on earth would that be? Well, it wasn't protective against fractures. It was just that it happened to show that fractures were more common in the placebo group than were in the rotavirus vaccine group. But certainly, rotavirus vaccine doesn't prevent individuals from getting fractures. Now I want to talk about some myths. As I was preparing for this talk, and I was going on, I was like, you know what are the big issues out there? So I went online, which was my problem number one, and I was amazed at some of the things that are being said out there online that just fly in the face of normal physiology, pharmacology, and known health. So I picked out a few of them that hopefully I'll be able to bust a few myths for you today. The vaccine is going to change my DNA. It's going to get into my body, it's going to integrate, and all of a sudden I'm going to become a mutant. And I'm going to be driven, all my cells are going to be driven by this vaccine that's put this stuff into me, and it's now in my genes. That's not true. Messenger RNA is a signal. Our bodies have messenger RNA today, and that's how it makes all of our proteins. It doesn't get into your DNA. It's used as a coder to tell the body what proteins to make. It happens to be coded for a protein that's specific to the coronavirus that allows our body to recognize it, form antibodies, and now we can become immune to it. But it doesn't get into your DNA and change your DNA and make you a mutant. The vaccine is going to give me COVID. And I think this comes a lot from, I got the flu shot, and I'm not going to get the flu shot anymore because the flu shot gave me the flu. There is no question that when you get the COVID vaccine, that you might feel bad for a day or two, that you might feel like you have the aches, and you might feel that way. I can assure you that that's not an infection caused by the virus. It's the immune system that's doing the things that it needs to do to cause yourself to make you feel bad. Just like the flu shot doesn't give you the flu, but it may make you bad because the body's doing what it's supposed to do. And you might have a fever and you might have some feelings that way, but it's not giving you the infection. The third is, if I had COVID, I can't get the vaccine. That's one play on this, and that's false as well. There is guidelines that say if you've had the virus, you might want to wait 3 months before you get the vaccine, because we want, when we give you the vaccine, for your immune system to be focused on making antibodies for that. So just because you've had the virus doesn't mean that you can't get the vaccine. A question that I don't have the answer for is, if I've had COVID, should I get the vaccine? And I don't know that, and I'm in a situation with that as well. I had COVID back in December, and I'm now eligible to get the vaccine. Should I? And I have a personal choice, and I can look at all the information, I can make that choice for myself, but I can't stand up here today and tell you that beyond a reasonable doubt, this is what you should or should not do. There's things that we don't know about how long immunity lasts with a true infection versus a vaccine, and I think that we're just going to have to get more information to make that determination and that decision. And then the last one just really threw me for a loop for what I was reading out there. The COVID vaccine contains fetal tissues and microchips, because that microchips, the government is injecting them in you, and they're going to follow you, and they're going to watch you, and they know everything that you're doing. Not the case. Let's talk about the microchips. Who's heard the fetal tissue one? Yeah, lots of people heard the fetal tissue one. So the story on the fetal tissue one is that there are cell lines that we use in pharmaceutical research all the time, early on in the development, to try to understand at a cellular level what happens when we expose it to a drug, a medicine. There are cell lines. Who's heard of HeLa cells? Who's read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks? Good. If you've never read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, it's a great, great book. But they talk, the HeLa cells came from Henrietta Lacks, who was a lady back in the early 50s that had cervical cancer, and they cultured off the cells from her cervix, and lo and behold, these cells grew in petri dishes. This is the first time that was ever seen. Well, HeLa cells are, the HE and the LA is for Henrietta Lacks. So it's a big discussion about ethics in medicine and making sure people, that you as a human understand what your samples are being taken for and what they're being used for. But there's another cell line called HEK cells, human embryonic kidney cells. These cells came from the early 1970s from an aborted fetus that was an elective from, I believe, the Netherlands or Denmark. And these cells are also used early on in pharmaceutical development to understand how a drug might impact or react to how a cell might respond to those drugs. So many drugs in pharmaceutical development use these two cell lines, these dominant cell lines, to understand early clinical development with drugs. But the vaccines in themselves do not contain human embryonic fetal tissues within the injection that you're getting. Those were experiments done long before they ever became in the body. So pro-life individuals have asked, well, what's the moral story around but if there was some studies that were done using these cells back in the day, I might have some moral choices against those. And the Pope has come out and said that there's no real moral dilemma when talking about getting the COVID vaccine. So there's some good literature out there if you search and find for it to try to understand this piece as well. So that's what I have to talk with you today about. In conclusions, there's really 3 FDA-approved vaccines for COVID-19. All 3 of them have been demonstrated to be safe and effective. And there's really no one that you should prefer over the other if you were to go in to see your physician or clinician, and they should offer you one. You should feel that you're going to be getting a vaccine that's effective and safe. A lot of the other little things about, well, this one has to wait 3 weeks before the next one, and this one has to wait 4 weeks, and this one's just a single dose, and this one has to be kept in minus 80 degrees Celsius. And so there's some little discrepancies there. But from a efficacy and safety perspective, you should feel confident that if you choose to get the vaccine, any of the 3 that are available today, you should feel comfortable with that. To vaccinate or not to vaccinate, this is a risk-benefit decision for you. You can look at the literature and understand who does bad with COVID, and it's the elderly, comorbid diseases, etc. But that is a decision that you have to make for yourself, and only you know your health, and you can make that choice. Beware of social media. I tell my wife and daughter all that Facebook is for putting pictures of your children, your grandchildren, and your dogs. It's not a place to get into a debate about whether I should vaccinate or not vaccinate. And I'll leave that there. Trust. You can read things and get educated on the way people are thinking, but trust what they're saying, but yet verify that information. And when you go to verify, there's lots of places that you can go. I found the CDC website very helpful. I came across www.covid101.org as I was preparing for this, and I found a lot of great information there that I think is a good place for you to find information for yourselves as well. And then the final word I'll leave you is just be kind. We all recognize that this is a choice. It's a choice for me, it's a choice for you, and you can make that choice based upon your circumstances and your health for what risk-benefit tolerance that you want. Everyone else has the exact same risk and tolerance that they can choose as well. So if someone chooses to not get the vaccine for whatever reason, you can listen to them and appreciate their thought process around that. And you may choose to educate them and try to provide them some information that they can use to get a different perspective. But to and I talked with my brother-in-law, and I'll leave it at this, and then we'll open up for questions. My brother-in-law is he may be online. We'll see is he online? No, he's not online. He's very skeptical. He's very, very skeptical, and I used him, and I talked with him a lot about this talk and what I was going to present and how I was going to present it. But he's very skeptical about whether he gets it, and he and I get into some great debates. At the end of the day, obviously, I believe in a lot of Western medicine, and that I've grown my career for, and I have certain beliefs. And he has his as well. And we've just come to the agreement that I understand where he's coming from and why he thinks the way that he does. And he understands the way that I think and where I'm coming from. But yet, our 2 decisions are going to be completely, entirely different. So I'll stop there, open up for questions, and I'll do my best to answer them, knowing that I might not have all the answers either. Just like Dr. Fauci doesn't have all the answers, the president doesn't have all the answers, and our most brilliant scientists don't have all the answers as well. But we'll open up for some discussion. How long do we have for Q&A? All right. Or if anybody wants to shout one out, don't be shy. Don't be shy. All right. All right. Herd him. Let's see. Is he practicing? let's go from the top. Herd immunity. So herd immunity is the idea and the concept that if we can eradicate and get enough people vaccinated to where the virus can't go from individual to individual, that we can essentially reduce or eliminate. And I say eliminate with quotes because things like smallpox. Smallpox has been eradicated because enough people were vaccinated that it wasn't been able to be transmitted, and then it disappeared. It peaked around around the time of the terrorism when the people were sending around smallpox virus in envelopes through the mail, and it kind of peaked itself because smallpox exists in laboratories to do studies. But the idea is that if we can vaccinate enough people, the question becomes is that 60%, 70%, 80%, 90%, then we could have a tremendous impact because the virus won't be able to infect as many different people. So this is where the government is saying, well, we want to try to get up to 70% because we believe that if 70% of the community is vaccinated, we can then put a damper on this infection. So that's herd immunity. Can people still pass the virus to others even if they were vaccinated? And I think we're learning more about this, and I think that the J&J vaccine trial actually showed that people that were vaccinated, they harbored a virus, but the virus was not active. So if you think about it, how can you spread a virus to another person if that virus is not actively replicating? So there's more coming out now, and I think that this is one of the big questions that's going to determine whether we stop wearing masks and all these things, is that can we prevent, by getting vaccinated, I can still not transmit it to other people and other individuals. Did that answer the question? Any follow-up on that one? All right. Is it correct to say that having antibodies, so after an infection, I got antibodies, now I'm potentially protected for the same strain of COVID because my body acts the same way as if I were to get the vaccine? Provides similar protection to COVID than the vaccine provides. So we don't know the answer, but I'll tell you the way that I think about it. We know that getting a second infection is possible, but it's extremely rare. So why is that? If this virus is infecting so many millions of people per day, why is it that second infections aren't very common? And it's probably because that infection that you had caused you to produce antibodies that are now protecting you from getting it again. The question we just don't know is, well, how long is it going to last? When we give a vaccine, we know exactly how many milligrams we're injecting and what the immune response is. When we get infected, we don't really have that luxury to say, do I want to get a high load of virus or do I want to get a low load of virus? So because vaccines are very controlled and we know how much we're getting, it's much more predictable about what that immune response is. So again, this becomes, I'll use my brother-in-law as an example again. His thought is, you know what? I'm a young guy. I'm pretty healthy. I watch what I put into my body. I eat well. I don't put junk in. I don't have any comorbidities. On the other side, I'd like to see a little bit more longer-term safety data with that. So I'm going to choose to not get vaccinated because if I do get infected, if I look at the probability of me getting serious infection, it's very, very low. And I reminded him, I said, however, that's true. I just hope you're not the guy that's sitting at the blackjack table that doubles down on an 8 and you have 18 and the dealer draws a 5 and gets 21. And you're not going to know it until then. So you have to make that decision. And my response is I'll take that chance. And he certainly has the right to take that chance. Oh, this is a good question. How are vaccines determined to be safe and effective if they've not been around that long? So there's two pieces of safety information that we're interested when running clinical trials. I want to know what happens in the near term related to the drug in which I'm getting, whether it be a vaccine or something else. But then I also want to know what the long-term effects are also. This question actually pertains not only to the current COVID vaccines, but this pertains to all clinical trials that we do for medicines. We get a good insight to the first 1 year, 2 years, 3 years of exposure and what adverse events are, assuming that patients that participated in the study 3 years ago, I now have access to them so I could find out what health benefits or health problems you've encountered. But we don't know that for current drugs as well as vaccines. So it is very rare to come up and identify an adverse event for a drug 2 years later. It's usually within the first 6 to 9 months where we see things happen. The one that I think is most, that's actually killed quite a few drugs on the market is liver toxicities. If you're going to get liver toxicity from a drug, it's going to manifest itself not 5 years from now, it's going to manifest itself in 6 to 9 months. So because we've had a year, have we had enough time to identify the really, really big bad things? A majority of them, not every single one of them. So we do have that. It's a tough question to answer because we want to know all the answers, because if it's going to cause pancreatic cancer 5 years from now, wouldn't I want to know that? Wouldn't I want to know that now? And how do I use that to make that decision? But I can tell you that it's very, very rare for drugs that we put in our body to cause problems years and years and years later, with the exception of certain types of cancers. Any follow-up to that one that you want to talk about? Oh yeah, here's another one. Vaccines during pregnancy. So I don't want to, I'll answer the question, but I'm not providing any medical advice to you. I think that this question needs to be talked with your doctor, and you make that risk-benefit decision with your doctor. But currently, the American Academy of Pediatrics does recommend that pregnant women can get vaccinated, that there's no evidence that it has any negative impact on the fetus. But the fertility question has come up, and there's a lot of information out there as well on this. Who answered this question? I thought they're the best. Either Johns Hopkins infectious disease team or the South Dakota infectious disease team. So there was a post back in 2020 on social media that said that the spike protein for coronavirus, you remember we make an antibody against that spike protein, and now we eliminate and eradicate things that are foreign. They came out and said, wait, that spike protein looks very, very similar to another protein that's required for a fertilized egg to implant on the placenta. So what's going to happen when that protein that's meant to cause that egg to implant on the placenta for the fetus to grow, if all of a sudden the body says, wait a minute, I see something that shouldn't be here because it looks like the COVID protein, now produces antibodies and it destroys that egg. Enough work has been done to show, number one, that the proteins are very, very different, and that's unlikely for that to occur. In addition, I believe it was either the Pfizer clinical trial or the Moderna, I think it was the Pfizer clinical trial. There were 20 women who got pregnant while in the study, and there was one case of the fetus getting aborted during the study, and that patient was in the placebo group. So again, there's no real evidence that suggests and supports that it's going to have a long-term impact on fertility during pregnancy. Good questions, and they all could have been one of our myth-buster topics as well. Yes, so messenger RNA vaccines have been studied for a while. You're going to hear there was you probably heard that there was some experiments done with SARS-CoV-1 vaccines back in the early 2000s. And my brother-in-law brought this up to me as well, and I went back and looked at those studies that were published in the early 2000s. Those studies were not done with messenger RNA vaccines, where they talked about infecting ferrets with coronavirus. In fact, those studies were done using a viral vector. So they took a virus, put the messenger RNA in the virus, and used, so same idea. It was messenger RNA, but they were using a viral vector to inject the messenger RNA. And in the ferrets, they saw hepatotoxicity. They saw liver toxicity that appeared in the ferrets. They didn't see, I've heard reports that they gave it and all these ferrets died. And I could not find the papers that showed all of these ferrets dying. So it did use messenger RNA, but it wasn't the technology in which we're doing now. We're actually manufacturing mRNA and injecting it straight without the viral vector. In addition, the virus that they used in that study was the virus that causes chickenpox, not the adenovirus that's used in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So very, 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 very different. But good question as well. Was the one back here? Yeah. There have been people that have died while in the studies. That is correct. So in the study, so the study will look at you for a certain period of time. If you looked at the number of deaths due to COVID, the numbers that I showed you is 100% effective in preventing deaths and hospitalizations due to hospitalizations due to serious disease. But when you're participating in a clinical trial, life goes on, and there'll be people that died. What's hard to do as an investigator is when an individual dies, I have to adjudicate and figure out why did they die and attribute that, whether it's drug related or it is not drug related. So how do you adjudicate a individual that may have stage 4 breast cancer, who's now a participant in your clinical trial, and they die 3 months after they get the vaccine? We have to. I use that as an example to kind of try to make a point. That patient may be excluded from the clinical trials, but there's other reasons for death that could happen that make it very, very difficult to do. So, yeah. And I think that there's reasons to believe this. And what I can tell you, what we know is that when this first came out, Medicare provided additional payments for hospitals if someone came in and was diagnosed with COVID. And so the CDC actually put out guidances and guidelines for recommending how the death certificate is filled out. So you could have an individual that came in with a respiratory syndrome, fluid on their lungs, that you could not identify COVID for whatever reason, but it looks like COVID, it looks like all these other people that have COVID, and they were exposed at a family picnic to someone who might have had COVID. You could now put probable COVID on the death certificate, and that would be tagged. So were there some increase in overinflation of some numbers potentially? Some people believe that there might have been, and there was a financial incentive for some of the hospitals to do that because of how they were being reimbursed by Medicare. So I understand that there's a lot of reasons, a lot of things out there to be skeptical for. I think at the end of the day, when I take a look back at the information, the data that Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J are providing us to understand whether they're effective or not, and whether they can be effective, I'm able to form an opinion. I'll give you another example. My friend whose father went to the funeral, and for someone who died, and she ultimately, and her father ultimately attracted it. The story didn't end there. The mother got it, the brother got it, the sister got it. All these people in their family got it, and my friend Hina was like, "Who's going to take care of my family?" She lived in Georgia, and they're in North Carolina. Hina happened to be a participant in the Moderna vaccine trial, and she didn't know whether she had drug or whether she had placebo, but she chose to say, you know what, I'm the only person that can go take care of my sick family. So she went in there, wore her mask, did everything that she could do, and she didn't get infected. She ultimately found out that she had the vaccine. So those are anecdotal one-offs that you kind of hear about, but there's this big population health that you also have to take into consideration as well. Yes, ma'am. Who shouldn't take the vaccine? Well, The immunocompromised is a hard one because there's I don't know there's guidances and guidelines that I don't know exactly, but I'll tell you my opinion based upon physiology and health is that immunocompromised is a hard one because on one end, if they're immunocompromised, they may not mount an immune response, but if they're immunocompromised, they're going to be the greatest risk for getting the infection and having bad things happen. So I think there becomes a risk benefit, and I probably, and if I had to guess what the guidelines say, it probably is that the risk of something bad happening with the vaccine, some horrible adverse event that's going to impact you relative to your immunocompromised status, it's probably going to be weighed more on the benefit side of the vaccine than the risk, would be what I would expect the guidelines to say. Yeah, and that's another question that we want to have, because if the immune system can kick on, I've seen people die in the hospital from a bacterial infection that shouldn't have killed them. What killed them wasn't the bug. It was your overwhelming response to that infection, what's called sepsis. And it's your body's response to something that's overactive that ultimately sends everything into haywire. And that's what you ultimately die from. So if you can if you had an opportunity to try to shift that infection to a more mild infection that didn't cause that massive immune response, could there be a health benefit to you as the individual? And that's a tough one to answer, especially when you're sitting in the face with, but we don't know the long-term consequences, but we don't know this, and we don't know this, and don't know that. Yeah, it's funny, and thanks for the props about diplomatic, because I told David, I was like, I don't know if I want to walk into this stuff.
So it looks like we have 2 more questions, and those will be our last 2 questions.
Yes. We'll go back here, and then we'll come back up front. Yes.
Is there enough information to know the efficacy of the vaccine to the second and third wave strain?
Yes, so variants. We didn't even talk about variants, and what is a variant? And this is where the proponents for vaccination really highlight the variants. I think that the variants that are emerging, we're comfortable that the vaccine, that they share the same spike protein. It's all around that spike protein. And if you can have a variant that changes something else but doesn't change that spike protein, then you're going to be effective in treating that variant. The proponents for vaccination around variants come out and say, look, if we can vaccinate everyone, we shouldn't have to worry about variants, because the way that you mutate, virus mutates, is by replicating. And if the virus isn't replicating, it's not mutating. But the way we can prevent replication is by vaccination. So we want to vaccinate everyone to prevent those infections from happening where that virus can replicate, and just because of pure chance in biology, it can mutate. So that's why everyone's saying let's vaccinate so we can potentially have an impact on preventing infection by those variants. But to date, the variants that have emerged all share the same spike protein. So they're changing somewhere else, not on the piece that's recognized by the vaccine. I might be being recorded. So I'll tell you what one of the things, if you're the pharmaceutical industry, you want it to be annual, and you don't want it one and done. I don't know. What I do know is that the likelihood of mutations for the coronavirus is very, very different than the mutations that happen with the flu virus. What we do with the flu virus every year is we look at what have been the strains that have infected us in the past, and I'm going to be really smart. I'm going to predict this season what strains are going to emerge. And we put different strains in that flu vaccine because it can mutate. And sometimes we get it right, and sometimes we get it wrong. But I believe that it's probably not going to be an annual vaccine, because the mutation rates of a coronavirus are that are similar to the measles, the mumps, those types of viruses that don't mutate very frequently. And then the final question up here, Donna.
In regards to the immunocompromised people, my daughter has MS, and the MS clinic in Dallas, they went up there, recommended getting it, and also all she had to do was stop her medicine
because there's medicines that you to take to block the immune system because you don't want your immune system kicking up and doing things. So yeah, I think it comes back to the risk of harm versus the risk of the infection and taking into account the individual's risk for having severe disease for whatever those what those risk factors are. But I'll wrap it and just say it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. It's a very, very tough question to answer. You're trying to apply population health to an individual decision, and that's what we have to do in medicine all the time. There's a lot of good information out there. There's a lot of not so good information out there, and the hard thing for us is to try to navigate us through what we choose to believe and what we don't. But again, thank you and thanks for the opportunity,
Awesome.
Donna.
Thank you, John. I think that he accomplished what we asked him to accomplish, right? Do you guys feel equipped with more knowledge than you had when you got here? I definitely do.